For years, Hitler's war machine seemed unstoppable, crushing nations with terrifying speed and precision. But in one brutal clash, his streak of victory snapped, exposing the fatal flaws behind his ambition. This is the battle that turned Hitler's luck into disaster and changed the course of World War II forever. At the height of World War II, Adolf Hitler believed he was untouchable. Every gamble he took seemed to pay off, and every nation that stood in his path fell with astonishing speed. His rapid conquests across Europe created the powerful illusion that Nazi Germany was too strong, too strategic, and too ruthless to ever be stopped. But behind the scenes, that confidence was slowly turning into arrogance, and the decisions made from that arrogance would soon lead him straight into one of the biggest disasters of his military career. By the time he launched the campaign that would trigger this turning point, Hitler was convinced that the outcome was already written in his favor. His generals warned him, his advisors hesitated, and even Germany's stretched supply lines hinted at danger, but none of it mattered. He believed the enemy would collapse just like all the others had. What followed instead was a brutal wake-up call. The opposing forces did not crumble, they dug in. They fought back with a level of determination that shattered every expectation the Nazis had. As conditions worsened and the battle dragged on, it became clear that Hitler had underestimated not only the enemy, but also the limits of his own empire. Every mistake he dismissed became a threat, every delay became a weakness, and every lost soldier became a sign of a disaster unfolding in slow motion. This was the moment when Hitler's luck ran out, the moment when the tide of war shifted, and the moment historians now see as the beginning of his downfall, when examining the turning point that transformed Hitler's seemingly unstoppable success into a slow and irreversible collapse. It is essential to step back and understand the world he had engineered by the early stages of World War II. Hitler did not simply stumble into early victories. He had carefully orchestrated a military system built on speed, shock, and intimidation. His blitzkrieg tactics combining tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry created a psychological and battlefield dominance that Europe had never seen before. Nazi propaganda amplified this aura of invincibility, presenting Hitler as a visionary leader whose intuition surpassed the logic of his generals. This illusion became so deeply rooted that even Germany's opponents reluctantly acknowledged the terrifying efficiency of his campaigns. But illusions are fragile, and the one Hitler created was no exception. Beneath the surface of triumph lay strategic miscalculations, overlooked warnings, and a dangerous level of overconfidence that would soon be put to the ultimate test. The first phase of Hitler's success was built on exploiting weakness, not confronting equals. Poland was crushed before it could mobilize fully. France fell due to outdated tactics and internal political divisions. And smaller nations had neither the military capacity nor the alliances to resist Germany's rapid assaults. Every victory fed Hitler's belief that he understood war better than the generals who had trained their entire lives for it. He began ignoring professional military advice in favor of his personal instincts, convinced that destiny was on his side. Yet destiny in warfare is often shaped not by confidence, but by logistics, terrain, weather, and the resilience of the opposing force. Hitler underestimated all of these elements, especially when he decided to expand the war far beyond Germany's sustainable limits. As Hitler's empire widened, so did the strain on his military machine. The early conquests provided resources, but they also required troops to occupy, manage, and secure territories across Europe. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and Germany's economy, though strong, was not built for a prolonged global conflict. His generals recognized these risks, frequently advising caution, consolidation, or strategic pauses to allow the army to regroup. Hitler rejected almost all such advice, believing any delay would signal weakness. He became convinced that hesitation would encourage opposition and that boldness alone would keep Germany ahead. This mindset led him to the fateful decision that historians point to as one of the greatest strategic blunders in modern history. Launching an invasion that ignored the harsh lessons of geography, underestimated the resilience of the enemy, and exposed Germany to a battlefield where sheer willpower was not enough to guarantee victory. The road to this disastrous battle began long before the first shot was fired. It started with a flawed worldview, one in which Hitler saw enemies as weaker than they truly were. He assumed the opposing nation lacked unity, that its soldiers would not endure long, and that the shock of blitzkrieg would break morale quickly. His generals warned him that this enemy was different, vast in land, deep in manpower, capable of absorbing losses, and willing to sacrifice everything for survival. But Hitler dismissed these warnings. convinced that Germany's past successes were proof that his intuition was flawless. In his mind, the campaign would last only weeks, maybe months at most. He did not plan for a long war, nor did he prepare his troops for a long struggle. This overconfidence would soon meet the harsh reality of one of history's most unforgiving battlegrounds. Before the decisive confrontation began, signs of impending disaster were already visible. Germany's intelligence efforts were limited and often inaccurate, providing Hitler with a false sense of advantage. Reports underestimated the enemy's troop numbers, industrial capacity, and ability to mobilize reserves quickly. Worse still, Hitler's ideological views blinded him to strategic truths. He believed the opposing nation to be internally fragile, split by political tensions, and incapable of sustaining a long defensive campaign. This belief betrayed a fatal misunderstanding. The enemy's strength did not lie in political unity, but in its ability to transform adversity into resolve. Instead of collapsing under pressure, it hardened. Instead of retreating endlessly, it prepared its ground. What Hitler interpreted as weakness was, in fact, a temporary withdrawal designed to lure his forces deeper into unfamiliar territory. As German troops advanced, they encountered challenges the early campaigns had never posed. Distances were immense, draining fuel, exhausting soldiers, and wearing down machinery. Roads were poor, slowing movement, and straining supply systems that relied heavily on trucks and horses. Weather conditions shifted unpredictably, alternating between dust, mud, and extreme temperatures that German soldiers were not prepared for. Every mile gained came at a higher cost, and every city taken stretched the front line farther than German logistics could support. Still, Hitler pushed forward, determined to reach his objectives before the enemy could fully organize. Speed, he believed, was the key to victory. But speed meant overextension, and overextension would soon become the silent enemy that no German general could defeat. Meanwhile, the opposing nation used time as its greatest weapon. It evacuated industries, relocated factories, and mobilized millions of civilians to produce weapons on an unprecedented scale. Entire cities shifted their industrial engines eastward, out of Germany's reach. The German high command, accustomed to quick victories, failed to predict this level of resilience. Every delay on the battlefield allowed the enemy to grow stronger, not weaker. Every setback for Germany became an opportunity for the opposing side to reorganize, fortify, and prepare for counter. Hitler's refusal to adapt, combined with his insistence on maintaining offensives even when conditions were unfavorable, trapped Germany in a cycle of unsustainable momentum. By the time German troops approached the region that would host the decisive battle, exhaustion was already setting in. Soldiers who had once marched with confidence were now worn down by constant fighting. Harsh terrain and dwindling supplies. Equipment that had performed flawlessly in Western Europe began breaking down under harsher conditions. Tanks froze, engines stalled, and ammunition became scarce. Rations grew thin, morale dipped, and the once feared blitzkrieg lost the speed and shock value that had defined its success. Yet Hitler demanded continued assaults, convinced that one final push would break the enemy. This refusal to acknowledge reality pushed German forces deeper into danger, closer to a confrontation for which they were no longer adequately prepared. The enemy, on the other hand, had prepared the battlefield meticulously. They chose to stand and fight not randomly, but at a location that held symbolic, strategic, and psychological importance. The geographies favored defenders, allowing them to exploit natural cover, urban structures, and fortified positions. They used snipers, artillery, and small units with expert knowledge of the terrain to slow the German advance relentlessly. Every street, every building, and every river crossing became a small battleground. The Germans, who had crushed armies in open fields, now found themselves fighting a war of attrition in environments that erased their technological advantages. The more they pushed forward, the more casualties they suffered, and the deeper they sank into a trap that was tightening around them. One of the most significant miscalculations was Hitler's underestimation of the enemy as he to defend every inch of ground. He believed they would retreat as they had earlier in the campaign. Instead, they clung to defensive positions with ferocity that shocked even experienced German officers. Soldiers who had once expected quick victories now found themselves engaged in brutal house-to-house combat, fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. Hitler interpreted the resistance as a sign that the enemy was nearing collapse, further fueling his insistence on pressing forward. In reality, the enemy was buying time needed to prepare the counterstroke that would ultimately decide the battle. As the battle escalated, German supply lines became increasingly chaotic. Ammunition shipments were delayed, fuel shortages crippled mechanized units, and wounded soldiers overwhelmed medical facilities. Commanders begged for reinforcements and supplies, but the stretched German economy could not keep up with the pace of the fighting. Hitler refused to allow tactical withdrawals, declaring that any retreat was unacceptable. This decision sealed the fate of thousands of German soldiers who were forced to hold positions even when doing so was strategically disastrous. The enemy, recognizing the rigidity of German command orders, exploited this by launching attacks at points where withdrawal would have been the logical choice. Instead of being allowed to regroup, German units were slowly encircled and worn down. The stage was now set. German forces, once powerful and swift, were weakened, exhausted, and dangerously overextended. The enemy, once on the defensive, had gathered strength, reinforced positions, and prepared to strike back with overwhelming force. Hitler still did not recognize the danger. He believed victory was close, but he was wrong. The decisive moment, the battle that would transform his luck into disaster, was about to explode with full force. As the fighting intensified, the German high command realized that the situation on the ground was far more chaotic than Hitler's confident declarations suggested. Field reports painted a grim picture. Divisions were running dangerously low on ammunition. Armored units were immobilized due to fuel shortages, and infantry formations were exhausted from weeks of continuous combat. Commanders pleaded for permission to reorganize, but Hitler remained resolute in his refusal to yield even a single step. He believed that holding their positions at any cost would force the enemy into collapse. This belief, however, was disconnected from the reality unfolding on the battlefield. The enemy had no intention of collapsing. Instead, they were waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Deep within the enemy's command centers, plans for a massive counteroffensive were taking shape. Every delay imposed on German forces, every house-to-house skirmish, and every defensive stand was part of a broader strategy designed to drain the invaders' strength. The enemy's generals understood that Germany's overextended supply lines had created vulnerabilities too large to ignore. They identified weak points in the German formation, targeted communication hubs, and began positioning reserves in strategic locations. Unlike Hitler, who thought in terms of short bursts of aggression, the opposing generals were thinking in terms of sustained warfare that exploited German rigidity and capitalized on their logistical fragility. Their plan was not merely to repel the Germans, but to encircle and destroy them. On the ground, German soldiers felt the shift before their leaders acknowledged it. Patrols, sent out to scout enemy positions, reported increased troop activity, new fortifications, and heightened artillery presence. The sound of enemy preparations echoed across the battlefield, trenches being reinforced, vehicles moving into position, and artillery guns being calibrated for long-range bombardment. Still, orders from Berlin insisted that the enemy was in its final stages of collapse. The contradiction between Hitler's rhetoric and battlefield reality created frustration and confusion among officers who could see that conditions were rapidly deteriorating. Yet questioning the Führer's strategy was not tolerated, and so the German army marched forward into danger that was becoming impossible to ignore. The decisive moment arrived when the enemy forces launched a massive surprise assault. It began with an overwhelming barrage of artillery fire that targeted German command posts, supply depots, and communication lines. The sheer force of the bombardment shocked German troops, who had never expected the supposedly weakened enemy to strike with such power. Entire battalions were thrown into disarray as shells rained down on their positions, cutting off lines of retreat and severing coordination between units. The attack was not random. It was meticulously planned to disrupt German command, isolate divisions, and create chaos along the front lines. For the first time in the campaign, German forces found themselves unable to respond with their usual speed and organization. As the artillery bombardment subsided, waves of enemy infantry and armored units surged forward. Their advance was relentless, pushing into gaps created by the shelling and driving wedges between German positions. German soldiers fought desperately to hold their ground, but the enemy's numbers and momentum were overwhelming. The once confident Wehrmacht now faced an opponent fighting with newfound determination and strength. Battles that the Germans had assumed would be minor defensive clashes turned into catastrophic routs. Units that had been compelled to hold their positions without retreat were now trapped, unable to maneuver or escape. It was at this moment that the Germans realized the true scale of the disaster unfolding around them. The enemy's strategy became clear. They were aiming for instead of pushing the Germans back in a straight line, they attacked from multiple directions, slowly closing the ring around key German positions. This tactic, known for its devastating effectiveness, turned German strongholds into isolated pockets with no reinforcements and no supply routes. Hitler's refusal to allow retreats meant these positions became death traps. German officers sent urgent messages requesting permission to withdraw and regroup, but the orders remained unchanged. Hold the line at all costs. Many soldiers felt abandoned by their leadership, forced into hopeless situations where survival was increasingly unlikely. Inside the tightening encirclement, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled, forcing troops to ration what little remained. Ammunition shortages became so severe that some units were limited to a handful of shots per rifle each day. Wounded soldiers lay in makeshift shelters, unable to receive proper medical attention. The winter called on enemy Hitler had failed to prepare for an Altora through German ranks with brutal efficiency. Frostbite, illness, and exhaustion weakened soldiers even before they faced enemy fire. The harsh environment became as deadly as the battlefield itself, and German troops who had never trained for such conditions struggled to survive. Meanwhile, the enemy continued tightening their grip. They set up strong defensive lines around the encircled German forces, preventing any breakout attempts. Every German assault aimed at breaking through the ring was met with fierce resistance and often ended in heavy casualties. The enemy's mastery of the terrain and their use of fortified positions made every counterattack a desperate gamble. German commanders attempted coordinated breakout efforts, but without adequate fuel, artillery support, or air cover. These attempts were doomed from the start. The encirclement was now complete, and the trapped German army knew that reinforcements were unlikely to arrive in time. Back in Berlin, Hitler refused to accept the reality of the situation. He insisted that the encircled army would hold out until a relief force could break through. But the relief force, assembled hastily and without proper planning, lacked the strength to penetrate the enemy's fortified positions. Every attempt failed, leaving the trapped soldiers with dwindling hope. The psychological toll of realizing that rescue would not come was immense. Morale plummeted, and soldiers who had once believed in the inevitability of German victory now faced the grim truth that they had been sacrificed for the sake of Hitler's pride. The defeat was no longer a possibility, it was becoming an inevitability. The enemy intensified their pressure, launching targeted assaults on key defensive positions within the encircled pocket. German soldiers fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the enemy's attack. Entire regiments were wiped out, and command structures collapsed under the strain. The chaos made coordination impossible, and units were forced to act independently, often without any knowledge of the broader situation. The once disciplined German army, known for its precision and cohesion, now functioned in disjointed fragments, struggling merely to survive. As the enemy advanced, the circle of destruction grew smaller, compressing German forces into an ever-tightening area. News of the unfolding catastrophe began spreading beyond the battlefield. Axis allies were shocked, and even German civilians previously shielded by propaganda heard whispers of the disaster. Hitler, rather than acknowledging his mistakes, blamed his generals, accusing them of lacking courage and disobeying his orders. But the truth was unmistakable. It was his refusal to adapt, his obsession with holding territory, and his blind confidence in destiny that had led his army to this moment. Germany's aura of invincibility had been shattered, not by superior enemy technology, but by strategic arrogance and the refusal to accept battlefield realities. As the final phase of the battle approached, German forces were exhausted, starving, and surrounded. The enemy prepared for a final assault designed to crush all remaining resistance. German officers knew the end was near, but they fought on, driven by duty, fear, and the slim hope that the impossible might happen. Yet the outcome had long been sealed. Everything that had made Germany formidable in the early years of the war mobility, coordination, morale, and strategic initiative had been stripped away. All that remained was a trapped army waiting for the inevitable blow. This battle, once envisioned by Hitler as a swift and decisive victory, had now become the moment when his luck unmistakably turned into disaster. The stage was set for the final collapse inside the encircled ruins of his failed strategy. The final stage of the battle unfolded with a sense of grim inevitability. German forces trapped inside the encirclement could no longer maintain the illusion of control. Their lines, once robust and meticulously coordinated, had deteriorated into scattered pockets of resistance. Every soldier knew they were fighting not for victory, but for another hour, another day, another moment of survival. The thunder of enemy artillery became a constant reminder that their final stand was drawing closer. Despite their hopeless situation, many German units continued to resist with a determination born from desperation. But resistance alone could not reverse the fate that had been sealed by Hitler's refusal to retreat when there was still time. As enemy forces tightened the ring even further, they launched a series of coordinated assaults that targeted the remaining strongholds within the German perimeter. These strongholds, once organized defensive positions, had been reduced to piles of rubble and hastily dug trenches. German soldiers defended them with unmatched bravery, but bravery could not compensate for the overwhelming imbalance in manpower and resources. Each assault pushed the German defenders closer to collapse. The enemy advanced methodically, block by block, trench by trench, knowing that every meter gained brought them closer to total victory. The battlefield became a brutal scene of exhaustion and carnage, where survival depended on instinct rather than strategy. Inside the shrinking pocket, the German command structure was unraveling. Communication lines had been destroyed, radios malfunctioned due to harsh conditions, and many officers had been killed or lost contact with their units. Commanders struggled to organize troops who were scattered, starving, and suffering from exposure. Snowstorms and freezing winds made it impossible for soldiers to rest or recover. Some troops huddled around small fires, risking enemy detection simply for a moment of warmth. The cold was merciless, and it became a predator as deadly as bullets or shells. Men collapsed from exhaustion and frostbite, unable to continue fighting even if they had the will. The once proud German army, which had marched confidently across Europe, had now been reduced to a battered shadow of its former self. As the situation deteriorated, surrender became an increasingly common topic among the encircled troops. For many soldiers, surrender was unthinkable a betrayal of duty, a violation of the discipline instilled in them from their earliest days in uniform. Yet the alternative was death in a battle that no longer had any strategic purpose. Some officers attempted to maintain discipline by insisting that reinforcements were on their way, but the truth could no longer be hidden. There would be no rescue, no breakout, no miracle to save them. Hitler's promises had proven empty, and his refusal to allow retreat had condemned an entire army to destruction. The growing realization of betrayal spread through the ranks, eroding morale and weakening the last threads of discipline holding them together. Meanwhile, in the enemy camp, the sense of an impending victory electrified the troops. They had endured unimaginable losses earlier in the war, but now they were on the brink of delivering a blow so devastating that it would reshape the entire conflict. Their commanders emphasized the symbolic importance of this moment. The defeat of a massive German force would not only break the enemy's military strength, but also send a powerful message to the world. Nazi Germany was not invincible. Encouraged by this vision, enemy soldiers pressed forward with renewed vigor. They fought not only to destroy the German army, but also to avenge the suffering inflicted upon their homeland. Every victory, no matter how small, fueled the momentum of the counteroffensive that was now crushing Hitler's ambitions. In the final days of the battle, the encircled German forces attempted one last series of breakout attempts. These attempts were acts of desperation rather than coordinated strategic efforts. Soldiers who were already starving and exhausted threw themselves into attacks against heavily fortified enemy positions. The assaults failed repeatedly, often ending with massive casualties. Every failure diminished the hope of escape and reinforced the hopelessness of their situation. The enemy anticipated these attempts and reinforced their lines with additional troops, ensuring that no German unit could penetrate the cordon. The once feared German mobility was now non-existent, crippled by lack of fuel, broken machinery, and the sheer weight of enemy resistance. Inside the encirclement, starvation became the dominant force. Rations had long since run out, and soldiers scoured abandoned houses and destroyed supply dumps for anything edible. Some resorted to boiling leather straps or eating snow mixed with scraps of food. The lack of nourishment weakened even the strongest among them. Wounds that would have been treatable under normal circumstances became fatal due to infection and lack of medical supplies. The wounded lay in unheated shelters, many covered with makeshift blankets, waiting helplessly for an enemy attack or the slow approach of death. The suffering was immense, and the once disciplined German army had been reduced to a humanitarian catastrophe within its own lines. It was at this point that the enemy prepared the final blow. They organized a massive assault designed to overwhelm the remaining German defenders in a single, decisive strike. Artillery softened the German positions for hours, turning the ground into a landscape of smoke, fire, and shattered earth. When the barrage lifted, waves of enemy infantry advanced with coordinated precision. German soldiers who had been weakened by hunger and cold fought with whatever strength they had left, but their efforts were futile. Entire units were overrun in minutes. Some soldiers surrendered immediately. Others fought until they ran out of ammunition. The lines collapsed faster than anyone expected. signaling the end of organized resistance. As enemy troops swept through the remaining German positions, they encountered scenes of devastation that revealed the full scale of a disaster. Thousands of German soldiers lay dead or severely wounded. Others stumbled from trenches with their hands raised, too exhausted to continue fighting. The enemy gathered prisoners by the thousands, stunned by how many German troops had been trapped in the pocket. The scale of the surrender shocked the world and exposed the catastrophic failure of Hitler's strategy. It was one of the largest German military defeats in history, and its consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Back in Berlin, the impact of the defeat was immediate and profound. Hitler was furious, blaming his generals, the weather, and imagined betrayal rather than his own decisions. But no amount of blame could hide the truth. His overconfidence had led Germany into a disaster from which it would never fully recover. The defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and emboldened the Allies, who now saw that the German war machine could be stopped. It also marked a turning point in the morale of the German population, who realized that the war was no longer going in their favor. The enemy, now fueled by victory, launched a series of offensives that pushed the Germans farther and farther back. The loss of so many experienced troops, equipment, and supplies crippled Germany's ability to wage war effectively. Strategic initiative shifted entirely to the Allies, who now pressed the advantage relentlessly. Hitler's dream of domination began collapsing layer by layer, and the battle that had once seemed like another step toward victory had instead become the symbol of his downfall. This was the battle that turned Hitler's luck into disaster. It exposed the fatal flaws in his leadership, destroyed one of his strongest armies, and marked the moment when World War II shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. The consequences reverberated through every front of the war, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Third Reich. What began as a confident assault ended as a catastrophic defeat, forever remembered as the turning point that shattered Hitler's ambitions and changed the course of history. The battle that Hitler once believed would solidify his dominance instead became the moment that exposed the deep cracks in his strategy, leadership, and vision. What unfolded was not a simple military defeat, but a catastrophic unraveling of everything that had fueled Germany's early victories. The encirclement, the loss of entire divisions, and the collapse of supply lines revealed the fatal consequences of arrogance disguised as confidence. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality, his obsession with holding ground at any cost, and his belief that sheer willpower could overcome logistics and logic turned a bold offensive into a devastating catastrophe. This battle did more than stop. The German advance had shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and showed the world that Hitler's war machine was not unstoppable, but dangerously flawed. For the enemy, the victory became a symbol of resilience and unity, proof that even the most powerful aggressor could be defeated through perseverance and strategic patience. For Germany, the defeat marked the beginning of a downward spiral from which it would never fully recover. The loss of manpower, equipment, and morale created wounds that could not be healed, no matter how desperately Hitler tried to shift blame or rally his people. From this point forward, the war took on an entirely new shape. The momentum swung decisively to the Allies, who now sensed that the tide had turned permanently against the Third Reich. In the years that followed, many more battles would be fought, but none would erase the impact of this single turning point. It marked the moment when Hitler's luck ran out and his downfall began. The battle stands today as a powerful reminder that overconfidence can lead even the most formidable force into disaster, and that history often turns not on bold declarations, but on the hard lessons learned when ambition meets its limits.